Good evening and welcome to Inside Fox, the UK Column's occasional interview programme. This evening, I'm delighted to be joined by the former head of US Army Criminal Law Division and former Virginia State Senator Richard Black. Welcome to the programme.
Thank you. It's very good to be with you, and I hear very good things about your program.
Thank you very much. Just to start off, would you just mind saying a few words about your career for a British audience that may not be familiar?
Yes, I started off as a combat officer in Vietnam. I flew helicopters in battle, 269 combat missions. Came back with bullet holes in the plane 4 times. And then I volunteered to fight on the ground with the 1st Marine Division and was in very bitter combat with them. And on the last patrol that I made, I was wounded and both of my radio men were killed while we were trying to rescue some Marines who were surrounded by communist forces. I returned from Vietnam. I was an instructor pilot and then an engineer company commander, Marine company commander. And after that, returned to school. I'm a lawyer, received a law degree, an accounting degree. And then I went into the Army JAG Corps, Judge Advocate General's Corps. And so I had a number of key assignments, and then I ended up as the chief of the Criminal Law Division in the Army and the Pentagon, and testified before Congress and wrote executive orders for the president's signature and advised the U.S. Senate Armed Services Committee on high-profile things involving the military.
And then you became a state senator. And now you are considered a Republican. So you are a supporter of Donald Trump? Would that be a fair assessment?
Yes, I am a supporter of Donald Trump. There are things that I disagree with. I'm not where he is on Iran. But I am just grateful that he has been slightly less aggressive with Syria. He has genuinely tried to pull us out of Syria, but he was blocked. When he gave the order to withdraw all troops immediately, General Mattis resigned in order to break up the chain of command and make it very difficult to convey orders. And John Bolton, who was the national security advisor at the time, immediately flew to Tel Aviv and countermanded the president's order overseas. And effectively, between the two of them, they managed to block the withdrawal from Syria, which certainly would have saved thousands of lives by this time. So I support what he's tried to do. And I hope he's able to carry out some of the more peaceful initiatives in Afghanistan and in Syria, but that remains to be seen.
Now, of course, you are well known for your interest in Syria, and you've been there a number of times. And I believe you've met colleagues of ours, Vanessa Milley and the Reverend Andrew Ashdown, for example. So what was it that sort of made you take an interest in Syria, and why did you decide to go to have a look for yourself?
It's rather unique because the war had not begun in Syria when I first took an interest, and I took a very keen interest in what was happening in Libya, and I asked, well, why are we launching an unprovoked attack on what was actually kind of an allied country in Libya? And that led me to discover the fact that what we were doing, among other things, I mean, we looted the treasury of a vast amount of wealth. There were several countries, the UK, France, and the United States were all in there sort of as a group of pirates, basically taking out the wealth of Syria. And but the thing that I think most provoked our attack on Syria was the fact that they had a large store of advanced weapons, and we took those, we shipped them to Turkey and then across the border into Syria in order to start the terrorist uprising against the legitimate Syrian government.
Now, it's interesting you mentioned Libya, because I think I saw a video clip of you recently, and you were talking about color revolutions and revolutions of this type. You were describing the way that these things tend to go, and used Libya as an example. And you were talking, if I remember correctly, you were talking about getting to the point where the snipers come out and people that are on the ground, perhaps campaigning or activists, start to feel like they're being shot at by their own governments. And as you were talking about that process that happened in Libya, I remember back to 2011, and it's quite similar to what was going on in Syria at that time. Is this is something, a sort of template that seems to roll out in many of these types of operations, do you feel?
It definitely is a standard operating procedure for both the CIA and MI6. For example, in Syria, after the Arab Spring, which I think was essentially an intelligence action, there were some legitimate demonstrations in Syria. All countries have demonstrations. We've had them. I've been involved in demonstrations myself. That's just part of people's expressing their views. So they did have some of those, but I've talked to several people who were involved in the initial demonstration. They said within a month, they were taken over by Al-Qaeda, and they said people would start showing up to the rallies with automatic weapons, which were not easily available in Syria. And they started carrying Al-Qaeda flags that would say, you know, death to the Alawites, death to the Christians. And they very quickly took over what had been ordinary demonstrations. So within about a month, perhaps 2 months in some cities, they had taken over. And then what they would do, President Assad gave orders in some of the cities. He said, I will not have troops armed with weapons, so give them a billy club. And they would go out, and then what would happen is Al-Qaeda would put snipers up in the buildings, and they would shoot a demonstrator, and then they would shoot one of the police officers, and then a demonstrator, police officer. Well, at a certain point, even though these people, in some cases, were just armed with billy clubs, the other side was convinced that they were being killed by the government, and vice versa. This is an old technique. We used it to overthrow the government of Ukraine, where we had rather violent protesters in the Ukraine, and between MI6 and CIA and the revolutionaries there, they began to just kill members of the government of Ukraine, the legitimate government of Ukraine, until finally it all just came unglued. Of course, always part of this is that the UK and the United States will organize their media so that the media puts out the word that these terrible governments of Libya, Syria, Ukraine, they're out there and they're just willy-nilly killing innocent people. It's all a lie, no truth to it whatsoever. But people really don't know enough about foreign affairs to track it, and so it's very effective. And both MI6 and CIA have gotten away with it for generations.
Now, of course, one of the reasons they do get away with it is, as you say, people aren't really understanding what's going on, and a key part of that is the fact that the mainstream press isn't telling the truth with respect to what's going on in these countries and with these regime change operations. How much do you blame the mainstream press for Libya and Ukraine, for example? Now in Syria, something has happened and the regime change hasn't been completed. And I wonder what the role of social media was in making sure that didn't go that way. But first of all, just be interested in your thoughts on the role of the mainstream media in facilitating these regime change operations.
Well, within the United States, there are a couple of organizations. The Associated Press takes articles and they distribute them to newspapers all over the country that do not have news services of their own. So if you are the Miami Herald, typically you're going to pick up articles that are being written by the AP and you're going to print them, maybe make some modifications. So you have that, and then you have the New York Times and the Washington Post. And between the two of them, the Times and the Post do have the ability to do some reporting on their own. And so these are the three organizations, and they shape the narrative. They dominate the narrative. It's almost impossible for any other newspaper to publish anything. What they say then flows into the broadcast media. Typically, the broadcast media they will screen out things that the Washington Post and the New York Times put in print. And so by the time that it reaches the consumer of information, the sort of Joe Sixpack, the person who watches Oprah Winfrey and then happens to click over to a news story, it is so distorted that it bears little semblance to the truth.
Absolutely. Now I'm just going to throw something else into the mix here, if I may, because we've shown this on our programs before, but an American audience may not appreciate this. This is Juliet Harkin, who used to work for a little organization called the BBC Media Action, which is a subsidiary of the BBC. And she was talking about Syria and saying that that's BBC Media Action, worked in 2004 with individuals within the Syrian ministry who wanted change and tried to get them to be the drivers of that. All media development work, she said, that has been done in Syria has, in my opinion, been predicated upon this idea that there can be change from within. You have an authoritarian regime and you find who the reformers are within that and you work with them. Now, she was talking about BBC Media Action's activities in 2004. So clearly this regime change operation was in play for quite a lot longer than the beginning of the events of 2011. But then a couple of years ago, some hackers released some documents which became known as Integrity Initiative documents, but those same hackers have now released some new documents, and this is a new project that they're highlighting, a Foreign and Commonwealth Office project called Syria Strategic Communications Research, Monitoring, Evaluation, Operational Support. And the text says that the project's aim was to select, train, support and mentor Syrian oppositionist media activists who abided by a set of values that were consistent with UK policy. A partnership was required between the UK, delivered through a commercial implementing partner, and the selected Syrians. The project needed to establish and support a network of Syrians operating both from outside and inside Syria with the necessary skills and equipment. And I think the reason that those two things are important is because one of the things that the mainstream press in the UK has been doing, and I would imagine in the United States as well, has been giving voices to a lot of people from within Syria that were being portrayed as being Syrians who were and who were discussing the activities of the Syrian government and how brutal the Syrian government was. But in fact, when we looked closely at those people, it was pretty clear that they were being helped and supported by foreign governments and foreign money. And so it's pretty difficult. So in other words, there's a narrative has been built which has been effectively laundered by the mainstream press in Britain, and I would imagine in the United States, based on people that have been funded by Western governments. And that seems to me to be shall we say, a perversion of the role of the press, which is supposed to be there to hold governments to account?
I think it is. And, you know, the intelligence agencies have used bribery. I spoke to the Syrian ambassador to the United Nations, Ambassador Al-Jafari, and he was offered millions of dollars if he would simply turn on his country. And I understand that this same thing was done in Libya, and it was done successfully in Libya. But with Ambassador Al-Jafari, he would not betray his country. So there's a lot of bribery that's going on. I know there are organizations within the United States, prominent organizations, that have simply been bribed, taken over with massive amounts of money in order to help to shape the narrative. It's very disturbing that in democratic countries, the United States and Great Britain, that the government is acting to deny people access to the truth. And they are actively distorting what the people know. Supposedly, in both countries, the people are supposed to have an impact, perhaps a decisive voice in their government. But the people can't have a genuine voice in their government if all that they hear are lies. We recently had a big flap about this Caesar. Now, Caesar, my impression, I don't have proof of this, but my impression is that Caesar was a CIA setup. This was back in 2013, many years ago. This fellow claimed to have photos of 50,000 people who had been killed in Syria's prisons, and he attributed that to President Assad. Well, he did have pictures of a lot of dead people, but that didn't prove anything. I saw one article subsequent to their publication that said, well, we have been able to identify 9 of these 50,000 as probably being people in government captivity. Well, that's nothing. I mean, that doesn't mean anything. It doesn't even mean that they identified 9 people. But here, 7 years goes by, and all of a sudden, Congress takes up this Caesar Act and says, well, you know, we've got to punish with very harsh sanctions, punish the Syrians for what happened in 2013. Now, it was interesting. The fellow who brought these supposed killings to light, when he came to the United States under deep cover, he was never identified. He wore a rubber raincoat and glasses. They gave him the name Caesar, which is not a Syrian name, so they weren't very creative. And he demanded to speak to the National Security Council. I doubt that there is one person in 100 who knows what the National Security Council is among Americans. So how many sergeants in the Syrian army know about the National Security Council?
Yeah.
0. Not one in the entire country knows about it. So the whole thing was just a total setup. And we see this happening over and over again. We see it with the supposed gas attacks. And I have challenged the media. I mean, I've done hundreds of interviews now, and I've said just once, let's have some journalist at one of these press conferences say, sir or madam, could you explain to us why, with Syria being faced with attacks by a dozen mechanized divisions of terrorist troops, why does President Assad always choose to use poison gas against women with baby strollers in the streets? Why, if he's so desperate to use poison gas, why doesn't he use it against enemy forces? There's not a journalist who will ask that question because they know that that's a career ender. Because there's clearly no answer to that question except that the whole thing is a setup.
We've been talking here about regime change in countries that are foreign to the United States and the United Kingdom. But in recent weeks, you've been talking about the potential for regime change in the United States. And so I want to move on to that now, because obviously you're well and truly in an election cycle at the moment. And you know, there is a possibility, if not a likelihood, bearing in mind the way that things are going for Joe Biden at the moment, that Donald Trump might be reelected. But there seems to be quite a bit of build-up now of talk of removal of Donald Trump from office. And I just wanted to understand exactly what it is that what you're seeing at the moment.
There is some very, very disturbing information that's coming out right now. I'll just start with the most recent thing. Just a couple of days ago, there was an announcement that Bob Woodward, who's a darling of the left, he has published an anti-Trump book called Rage. And in it, he gives a quote, and I don't think we have any reason to doubt its veracity. At the time this quote was made, General James Mattis was the Secretary of Defense, and Daniel Coates was the Director of National Intelligence. So he sits atop the pyramid that controls all intelligence agencies from the CIA on down. And the two of them were having a conversation, and General Mattis warned Dan Coates, and he said, quote, "There may come a time when we have to take collective action against Trump." I don't think, I would not interpret that to mean we've got to rally the troops and we've got to get a good Democrat into office. When he says we have to take collective action, I think he was talking about government agencies, and specifically the Directorate of National Intelligence and the Department of Defense. So that was the most recent. I mean, that just broke after I had done my interview about the talk of military coup. James Mattis sort of kicked off a frenzy of senior general officers coming out and condemning the president in the harshest of terms. And let's see, on June the 3rd, he issued a rather frightening denunciation of the president. It was interesting. I'm sure that your listeners are very aware of Black Lives Matter and Antifa and the phenomenal level of violence, the arson, the looting, the murders, the assassination of police officers, very widespread across the nation. And General Mattis actually praised the rioters for their wholesome and unifying demands. I don't see the assassination of police officers as wholesome, and but this was part of his message. And he said we're witnessing the consequences of 3 years without mature leadership. That's in his view. And then he said something that was, I think, very frightening for a military officer. He said, we can unite without him. They're talking about the President of the United States, that we can unite without him. And again, I don't interpret that as meaning that he is referring to, campaigning for an election against him. I think he's talking about something happening within the Department of Defense. That, at least that's how I personally interpreted it. And you combine that with what he said in Bob Woodward's book about the necessity of taking collective action at some point. And it's a very, very concerning.
Now, sorry. Let me just put that back on screen there for a second, because the quote, the rest of the quote after that was, "We can unite without him, drawing on the strengths inherent in our civil society." And the question here is, what is meant by civil society? And you're talking about Black Lives Matter and Antifa and so on, and these organizations are funded by civil society. And because when he's talking about civil society, he's not talking about you or I, he's talking about the foundation funded organizations that are out there, the third sector, operating outside of mainstream politics, but putting funding and organization into groups like Black Lives Matter and Antifa.
Well, Black Lives Matter and Antifa are extremely well funded. I mean, there are tens of millions of dollars being pumped in to those organizations every month. The Black Lives Matter has become an enormously wealthy organization. Major corporations are very frightened of them, and they donate to them so that they won't become the next victim. But I think one of the disturbing things is that many of these generals keep referring to peaceful protests and that type of thing. And I think anyone who looks with open eyes has got to see the cities burning, the people being chased down and beaten, sometimes just beaten almost to death, the police being assassinated. We had two policemen, one a policeman, one a policewoman, and one of the black individual came up, and while they were sitting in their car, he just pumped bullets into them. Both of them were hit 3 times with bullets, and they're in very serious condition. One of them, who knows whether he'll survive. But in any event, the woman was not hit in the head, and she was able to very heroically tend to her partner and give him first aid, even though she was bleeding all over the place. The two of them were taken to a hospital in Los Angeles, where they are today. Black Lives Matter gathered outside the hospital, and they chanted, "We hope you effing die. We hope you effing die." And the air is thundering with the sound of "We hope you effing die." And meanwhile, you've got these two very courageous police officers clinging to life. So the Black Lives Matter, which is the most racist organization that has ever been in existence in my lifetime, it's been infiltrated by Marxists. I think their objective is to bring about the downfall of the government, and so it's a very difficult time for us, and I think what these liberal generals, the retired generals, are doing, I think they are trying to undermine President Trump's ability to employ military force if necessary to maintain law and order.
I just want to, if I could, come to something else that you have mentioned in recent interviews on this subject, and that is this in Defense One. It's an open letter, all enemies, foreign and domestic, an open letter to General Milley. Now, first of all, who wrote this open letter?
There were two lieutenant colonels who did this. There's a John Nagel and a Paul Yingling. They sent an open letter to the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Mark Milley, and in it,
well, I have the quote here, so let me read some quotes from this because this is just staggering. We do not live in ordinary times, they said. The President of the United States is actively subverting our electoral system, threatening to remain in office in defiance of our Constitution. In a few months' time, you may have to choose between defying a lawless president or betraying your constitutional oath. We write to assist you in thinking clearly about that choice. If Donald Trump refuses to leave office at the expiration of his constitutional term, the United States military must remove him by force, and you must give that order. Now, first of all, I'm not aware, and maybe you can enlighten me on this, but when did Donald Trump at any point say that he would refuse to leave office?
He has never suggested that that would be the case. Now, it's interesting to note that the Democrats conducted essentially a war game of very senior political officials. It was financed by George Soros, and they gamed out what would happen under different scenarios. And I believe it was Mr. Podesta who said that under no circumstances should Joe Biden concede defeat, even if the election results were looking very bad for him. That he should just be tenacious. This ties in with this colonel's letter because they're saying if the president doesn't, if he's not gone by January 20th, if he doesn't accept the will of the people, then he needs to be taken out militarily. Well, we don't know what's going to happen. We don't know how the election will fare, but it would not be surprising if there is some uncertainty about where we stand at that point.
What is the constitutional position if, for example, COVID-19 second wave, if there was to be such a thing, interfered with the election, or if, for example, there was some question about the veracity of the postal votes or so on? What happens constitutionally in the event that there is a dispute with the election? Is it normal that the president stays on until that's resolved?
Well, I expect that even if there are disputes, that they will be resolved by January the 20th. We have an electoral college where electors cast their votes for president. Is rather involved, but in any event, there is the possibility that the Electoral College might not arrive at a decision. And if they do not, the election is thrown to the House of Representatives. And it appears that the way that it works, each state gets one vote. So even a massively populous state like New York gets only one vote, and then a very small state like New Hampshire gets one vote. And it appears that the Republicans have enough states to where they would prevail. I think that the election will be decided even if there are uncertainties with mail-in ballots and so forth. But in any event, the Constitution has no role for the military to play in sorting out any sort of an impasse in an election process. We have a judicial branch, we have Congress, and all of these elements of government will interact and they will sort it out. But it is quite clear, both constitutionally and historically, that the military forces have absolutely no role whatsoever to play. And we do not want to have an et tu brute moment as they had in Rome, where the senators decided that Julius Caesar was a threat to their power, and they assassinated him, which then brought about the downfall of the republic, and afterwards you had simply imperial dictatorship under people like Nero and Caligula. We don't need that in the United States. We need to let the Constitution do its work.
Now, coming back just briefly to the open letter, then let's just move on with it, because it said, at this moment of constitutional crisis, only two options remain. Under the first, U.S. military forces escort the former president from the White House grounds. Trump's little green men, so intimidating to lightly armed federal law enforcement agents, step aside and fade away, realizing they would not constitute a good morning's work for a brigade of the 82nd Airborne. And it said under the second, the US military remains inert while the Constitution dies. The succession of government is determined by extra legal violence between Trump's private army and street protesters. Black Lives Matter Plaza becomes Tahrir Square. And so that seems to be almost invoking the notion of color revolution.
It does. And if you look, there's a very, very poisonous atmosphere within the Department of Defense. Even when we have this open letter widely published in Defense One, which is a respected publication, there's no reaction from the Secretary of Defense. There's no reaction from Chairman of the Joint Chiefs Staff, Mark Milley. They both are just silence. There's this deafening silence from the Pentagon. There is no chance whatsoever that President Trump is likely to mobilize military force, because quite frankly, the Pentagon has such a poison atmosphere that any sort of an extra legal process that takes place in the Pentagon will take place against the president and not in support of him. The president has a great deal of support with the rank and file, the soldiers, sailors, airmen, Marines. They love the president, but the top generals have been, over the years, they've been weeded out by first Bill Clinton for 8 years, and then Barack Obama for 8 years, and now they are extremely weakened morally and in terms of, I think, their loyalty to the U.S. Constitution. So I believe that at this point, the threat is strictly a threat that they would somehow take power and use it to remove the president from office.
So this is a president who hasn't been pursuing the same regime change policy that previous presidents for the last 40 years at least, and probably longer, have been. It's a bit ironic perhaps that same type of operation seems to be waiting in the wings for him.
Well, yes, that is one way of looking at it. I think it's a bit nuanced. There are things that the president's doing that tend towards peace. He has tried several times to withdraw all forces from Syria, and he's met with dogged resistance from the deep state. He has made very substantial efforts to remove U.S. troops from Afghanistan, but he's a little bit outfoxed by the Pentagon because the president is not surrounded by loyalists who understand the military. The military has a way of playing shell games with troop strength, and so they will say, "Well, we're drawing down 40% of the troops in Iraq," and what they'll do is they'll move them across the border into Syria, spend a month or two there, and then they move them back into Iraq. Well, under the rules that govern troop strength, if they're out of the country, they may not count when they return to the country. They may just count as troops that are temporarily there, which don't count against the top number. So the president doesn't understand the shell game. I've been involved in the shell game personally when I was a Marine Company commander in Viegas, and we were on a 6-month tour, and we were rebuilding an airfield, and they said, "Well, Captain Black, we really like what you're doing. You're making great progress. We're just going to leave you down there." And then shortly, I got just a desperate, panicked phone call saying, "We didn't realize, but you can't hit that 6-month mark. You've got to abandon all of your equipment and get over to Roosevelt Roads, get on C-130s and fly back. You got to do it within 2 days." And we had to abandon all of our equipment. Bulldozed, had 22 dump trucks, for example. And now another company came down and took them over, but we had done all the work on them to maintain them and everything. So we didn't want to give them up. But it just made me keenly aware of the shell game, because back then Congress was trying to put a cap on overseas military deployments, and suddenly it got to the Pentagon that here my Marine company was going to be there for over 6 months, and suddenly we would count against the cap on troop strength. So I've seen how they play the shell games. I've been involved in it, and so President Trump, unfortunately he has not done a good job of surrounding himself with loyalists who can carry out his will. And that's what's kept us in Syria, and I think it's what's kept us in Afghanistan.
Okay, well, look, Senator Black, thank you very much for joining us. I'm afraid we're completely out of time. I'd like to thank you again for joining us today, and hopefully we can have you again with us in the very near future. But just to close, have you got any final thoughts about what's going to happen in the next few months with the election?
It's going to be very interesting, because I think the American people are beginning to realize how deadly this Black Lives Matter movement has become, how threatening it is. And I think there's a great concern about the violence that's generated by the Democratic Party through their various allies. I think it is likely that Trump will win, but at the same time, I've seen a lot of elections go in ways. I didn't expect him to win the last election, even though I gave the final speech for him on election night. He made a swing through 7 states, and I gave a rousing speech to 20,000 people that I got a lot of cheers because they were so fired up. But as I was getting down from the podium, I thought, I'm afraid it's not going to happen. And then lo and behold, it did happen. So these things are quite unpredictable, and we'll just have to wait and see what happens. But my concern, if the Democrats get in, is that they now have become such a force of violence and intimidation that our democracy is going to suffer very severely from whatever they decide that they're going to do.
Well, let's wait and see. Thank you very much for joining us. And as I say, hopefully we'll see you again in the not too distant future. Thank you.
Thank you for having me.